want to thank everyone for coming out. It means a lot, not only to me, but I know to my other peers and cohort members that are presenting not only today, but in the next few weeks. I don't think any of this could be possible without any of your support or any of the support from any of our readers as well. So it means a lot that y'all are here to listen to me yap about my thesis topic, which was fish consumption rate standards. More explicitly, the title is Exploring Variation Within Fish Consumption Rate Standards, and it was a comparative analysis of Washington and Oregon State. Before getting into it, I thought it would be beneficial to share my positionality on the topic as well. So this research, I want to make it known that it's strictly informed by my position and my position only as a student, studying environmental studies, primarily, as Shangri-La said, with a focus on environmental justice and regulatory processes, more specifically regarding this study. I do have lineage connected to the Yakama Nation, though I am not currently enrolled, and this connection has really shaped my interest in issues, like Shangri-La said, regarding tribal sovereignty, fish consumption rates, and environmental health. I do not speak on behalf of the Yakama Nation or any other tribal community, and I want to approach this work as an external researcher who's attentive to the importance of tribal perspectives as well. So to start to really dive into the nitty-gritty part of the study, I just wanted to provide some brief context. So to give more of a little bit of a background on the connection of salmon and toxins, I'm sure as we all know, salmon have shaped the lives of people who have lived here since time immemorial, whether that's through physical subsistence, and that's how they get a majority of their food, protein, what have you, through fish, not through that, but just through also through traditions and sacred practices as well. And the thing is that the health and abundance of these fish are threatened by environmental pollution, and they are continuously threatened by environmental pollution. And here's a little image I have on the right to really try my best to paint the picture for y'all. So you can see on the left, this is from the Washington Department of Ecology. So on the left, you can see all of the, not all toxins in the Puget Sound, but just some of the toxins that we have in the Puget Sound. And primarily the ones I was looking at in this study were mercury and PCBs, since those, primarily in Washington, those were the ones that were just more recently listed as toxics of concern. And if anyone is curious as to how these do get in our waterway, the major sources part in the middle will show you how these pollutants make our way into the waterways. So a good example for PCBs is residential trash burning and electrical equipment spills and leakages. And mercury, which I didn't even bother to think about, and I'm a little bit ashamed that I didn't know it prior to this study, is that it can make its way into our back into our environment just through improper disposal of a light bulb or even a thermometer, which I thought was really, really interesting. Obviously, not in a good way, but I did think that was pretty shocking to me. And piggybacking off of the pollution, due to that pollution, the health of high fish consumers are at such a risk, and that does demonstrate an environmental justice concern. Why? Because these high fish consumers, primarily tribal communities, eat fish at a much higher rate than the rest of the general United States population. A good example would be the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation. They actually adopted their own tribal fish consumption rate, and that is about 365 grams per day, and the Spokane's tribe is 869 grams per day. So when you're eating these fish at such a high rate, you're also eating fish that are filled with these toxins, especially when you take into consideration salmon. And why is that such a huge threat? Because these pollutants and these toxins love to hang out in really fatty tissues. So that's why we primarily see them not only in salmon, but primarily in Chinook, especially in the Puget Sound, because these toxins just love to hang out in the lipid content of these fish. So when you're eating polluted fish at a much higher rate, you have a disproportionate exposure to environmental health risks. So both states, Oregon and Washington, their They did revise their fish consumption rate standards in response to obviously outdated assumptions, which were the ones that failed to reflect both tribal and subsistence fishing practices. And these revisions were aimed to improve water quality protections while simultaneously addressing the concerns regarding environmental justice, public health, and just concerns for high fish consuming populations. So, some background and context, more so on Oregon and Washington. As of right now, the current fish consumption rate in both states is going to be 175 grams per day. Prior to both states revising their rate, Oregon revised it in 2011. That's when their final revision was adopted. Prior to that, their rate was 17.5 grams per day. And Washington, their adoption was finalized in 2016. Prior to that, their rate was 6.5 grams per day. So when you take those two rates and you look at 175 grams without really delving into it, you think, oh my gosh, that's so great. Because you go from that tiny little slab of salmon, which is pretty much one little bite of a sushi roll, pretty much that top little slab is not even slab, top little bite of salmon. When you go from that to 175 grams, realistically, does it look good when you look at the numbers? Yes. When you look at it laid out like that, it is nowhere close to what tribal members or even just high fish consuming populations eat on a day-to-day basis. So both states revised their water quality standards, which in turn changed the fish consumption rate. So that kind of goes on that bottom bullet point. When you have it can be both ways. So when you have a fish consumption rate change, or when you change the fish consumption rate, there's always going to be a change in water quality standards and vice versa. When you have a change in water quality standards, the fish consumption rate is also going to change, whether that's a decrease or an increase. If one of them changes, the other one will as well. So my research questions, the main one I really wanted to look at was, why do implementation patterns appear to differ between Washington and Oregon? Both bordering states, they both adopted the same rule of 175 grams per day. But just because they're both bordering states and they seem to operate under similar frameworks and they have the same revision, I really wanted to see, is just because they have all these similarities, how similar are they, if that makes sense? I really wanted to get into the nitty-gritty part of it. And additionally, if I had enough time in the study, which I did, I wanted to also explore what barriers or facilitators have influenced the implementation and decision-making process of these revised standards. And also, I was really, really interested to figure out if regulators actually believe that the revision of the fish consumption rate has meaningfully improved protections for high fish consuming populations, which we'll cover at the end. Very, very juicy information. So for my methodologies to really explore such a complex topic was a comparative analysis, obviously, of both Oregon and Washington. And then I conducted semi-structured interviews to go along with it as well. So for the comparative policy analysis, I narrowed it down into 3 steps. I collected policy documents, coded them through a qualitative software, and then after that, I followed it by identifying my themes and interpreting them, which led me to my results and discussion section, and followed the same process as well with my interviews. So for the policy document collection or policy documents, I chose about 2 per state. So I chose the one on the bottom there. I chose that for both Oregon and Washington. So I looked at the Environmental Protection Agency's revision for human health criteria for Oregon and Washington waters to really see why, to really get the reason from the EPA as to why they wanted to revise the water quality standards. Pretty much wanting to get their side of the story as to why they saw the revision to be good and why they agreed on 175 grams per day. And then I coded all of both documents for Washington and Oregon through Atlas TI, and I came across about 6 themes for both of them, including but not limited to stakeholder inputs, tribal engagement, regulatory processes, and both institutional barriers and facilitators as well. And for semi-structured interviews, I had about 5 participants. all of which worked closely or directly alongside the fish consumption rate revisions in both Oregon and Washington. And I was fortunate enough to actually work on this project with a collaborator who was also an MES graduate. And through that individual, they helped me get into contact with, I contacted about 6 people, only heard back from 5. So I conducted those interviews over the phone or over Zoom. And yeah, that went really, really awesome. And that was probably one of the best parts of this project. The interviews definitely provided a lot of insight. So talking about insight, to get to my results and findings, we have Oregon on the left, Washington on the right. So for Oregon, the revision was gradual and reoccurring. They demonstrated sustained collaboration efforts, and there were various influences to revise these standards. However, when you look at their neighbor, when you look at us here in Washington, our vision appeared a little bit more fragmented, which could potentially be seen as a barrier. But their stakeholder engagement also appeared a little bit more procedural and sporadic. So a little bit here, a little bit there. So for Oregon, it started way early. It started in 2005 was the first discussion at revising these fish consumption rates. And there were slim to no interruptions or political interventions like we saw in Washington, with just a few days after filing to revise their fish consumption rate, there were rulings withdrawn as following direction from the governor's office as well. So there we did see some political intervention in Washington, which I would view it as a barrier. In Oregon, their sustained collaboration efforts we saw very, very early on, as early as 2006, with multiple workshops with various stakeholders in the forest and agricultural businesses, other stakeholders like tribal members, and also they had intergovernmental workshops and comment periods and hearings as well, and the various influences to revise standards, just a little bit more stakeholder engagement than we saw in Washington, which, like I said, appeared a little bit more procedural and sporadic, really only through public comment hearings in, I believe, Spokane, Olympia, Seattle, and a few other cities in Washington, but it pretty much Washington seemed like, I'm trying to figure out the best way to say it, kind of a little bit in a hurry. It seemed a little bit more rushed and not as thought through as Oregon. And another thing for the interviews, 175 grams per day. Is it an improvement? Yes. Is it sufficient? Definitely not. So here's a quote from one of my interviews that the 175 grams per day that CRIPFIC, the Columbia River Intertribal Fishery Commission, did was a huge improvement since they did one of their first fish consumption rate studies back in 1994, which showed at the time that 175 grams did seem like a sufficient amount. But however, it was controversial amongst the tribes even then. And another quote from another interview, the pendulum is swinging back and that tribal folks are eating more and more fish, and that the 175 grams per day study that CRIPFIC did back in 1990 or whenever it was, that was more than 30 years ago. It's outdated. Is it better than 6.5? It is better than 6.5 grams a day, but it's not representative of what tribal folks are eating anymore. In fact, tribal folks are eating more and more and more. And let's see, let me go to my next one. And some other barriers that I did see, that I did come across as well, were funding. And then also, unfortunately, I do think this plays a role for future implications. There was a rollback of treaty rights as well. So for funding, here are some also quotes from my interviews, that the Puget Sound and Columbia River and other places, unfortunately, the environmental protection of them to ensure that these fish are abundant, they're clean, etc. As of right now, those are not priorities for funding sources. They are, in fact, severely underfunded. So we have organizations and agencies, they are still, both in Oregon and Washington, limited funding for outreach and education. Also, a huge barrier is that there's also a huge lack of funding for sampling of these anadromous fish. So there's no way to really test these the fish tissue to see if we're seeing any sort of improvement with the decrease of pollutants in the water, and also the decrease of the toxins building up in their fatty little tissue. And as a result of lack of funding, these advisories aren't reaching who needs to hear them most. And also, this is also demonstrated across the general United States population, I would argue as well, where a good majority of individuals are either unaware of fish consumption rates in general, or they're even unaware of any advisories being placed on certain species of fish. And also, I think what I would argue is the biggest barrier currently is the rollback of treaty rights. So here was the quote from an interview that tribal leaders received a notice from the EPA that they felt the rule exceeded EPA authority and they want to rescind the rule. What rule are we talking about? Unfortunately, we are talking about the treaty reserve rights rule. And that actually, this interview occurred April 15th. And as of that interview, they told me 2 weeks prior that tribes received a notice from the EPA that they felt that this rule exceeded EPA authority and that they're going to rescind the rule. So to paint a bigger picture for anyone that might not be super curious as to what treaty reserve rights rule is, it actually originated in 2024 as the water quality standards regulatory revisions to protect tribal reserved rights. So what does that really mean? It's going to require states to consider treaty reserved rights in their state actions. And in this meeting where the EPA met with tribes to let them know that they're starting to rescind the rule, there was no revised rule had been written or even thought about, and there were no lawyers present on the call as well. And as of right now, where we're at, several states are suing the EPA and litigation is still ongoing. So unfortunately, I don't have an answer as to what that looks like now or even what it'll look like for the future of both states and fish consumption rates. So to just conclude, the differences in implementation can be characterized by variation amongst the decision-making processes. But however, due to barriers, there has been no significant change has been seen and or attributed back to the Clean Water Act to trace it back to these water quality standards. And the study highlights the ongoing tensions between high fish consumers and the new rate, as well as the EPA proposing to roll back protections. And just to really end the presentation, I thought this would be a really good quote to end it on, as it's from my tribe as well, but also I think it relates very, very closely to the topic. My strength is from the fish, my blood is from the fish, from the roots and the berries, and the fish and the game are the essence of my life. And yeah, that's my thesis. Thank you guys.